Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing Workshop. I'm really excited today that we're joined by Dr. Sandro Steinbach, who's one of our own faculty here at NDSU and a Challey Institute Scholar. He's going to present on geoeconomic fragmentation and challenges and opportunities for the Midwest. And so I'm really excited to hear what he has to present today. Sandro Steinbach is an associate professor in the Department of Agribusiness and Applied Economics at North Dakota State University. He directs the Center for Agricultural Policy and Trade Studies and is a Challey Institute Scholar. Sandro completed his doctoral studies in economics with the Center for Economic Research at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland. He teaches undergraduate and graduate classes related to agricultural policy and trade, business management, and applied data analysis. Sandro's research focuses on agricultural trade and policy. He also conducts research in health and environmental economics. His work appears in the top field and general interest journals such as Nature Communications, Economics Letters, Journal of Health Economics, and NBER Working Paper Series, and other academic journals. And again, I'm really excited that Sandro is here with us today. So please, everyone, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Sandro Steinbach.
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be here today and have the chance to talk to you about a topic that is at my heart. I'm a trade economist, so I like to talk about trade and policy issues, actually. And today's topic, why geoeconomic fragmentation, is something that we all have seen likely in the news. Oh, that's the phone, this one. There is a lot of news, right, about Russia, Ukraine, COVID-19 issues related to the attacks of Hamas in Israel on October 7th. All these news coming daily, right, that are creating an environment that is characterized by increasing uncertainty. And that's not the uncertainty that you and I experience every day when we read the news, but that's also something that companies are concerned about, and that is a concern also for international trade and market integration. And these shifts are related also to how the global economy actually had been evolving over the last years. If we look at the left side of the graph, actually, you see the medium-term growth forecast for the global economy. We are comparing here advanced economies with developing economics. And you see a very clear trend, right? You see that the forecast had been coming down significantly, particularly since 2020. The numbers are far down, meaning that for advanced economies, the average growth forecast is about 2%. Well, that for developing economies had been coming down from about 6% to 4%. And that is a scaring outlook, right? If we think about how important growth is for income, for welfare, for well-being, and for development and food security and other issues, these numbers on the right hand might be really, really scaring. What you see here are relative GDP changes compared to the pre-pandemic period. US looks pretty good. We made good actually, which was largely due to the trillions of dollars of spending on consumption, basically. But if you go to the right side of the figure, you see that advanced economies already struggled, losing about 1% compared to a counterfactual scenario without the disruption that we have been seeing over the last 3 years. Once you move to the most right of that figure, you see that economic development among least developing countries had been down by about 7%. And that creates obviously a lot of concerns regarding the economic well-being of those countries, but also related to the economic well-being of its citizens. If we think about the Midwest and the economic development in the Midwest over the last 3 years, some interesting numbers as well. You see the right line shows the long-run economic growth forecast in real terms for the Midwest. It's about 1.9%. That's what the economy is usually growing every year. And over the last 3 years, the Midwest had been outperforming significantly. In 2021, right, average growth across the Midwestern states, the 12 states, there are different definitions. I refer here to the 12 Midwestern states, basically, had been about 7% quarterly. These are huge numbers, actually. So there had been a really good performance over those years. And then, right, 2022, 23, we see these numbers coming down. And that's the backdrop of this talk. It's Q4 2023, where we see actually that not just the global economy, but also the Midwestern economy isn't performing as well as had been before, with a growth forecast for Q4 being about 1%, significantly lower than the early average. So what leads to economic growth and why economic growth matters, right? When it comes to growth in the United States, about 70% of all the growth that we experience comes from consumption. We consume, the economy is growing. But at the same time, there are also other factors that drive economic development in the Midwest. For instance, investment, right? Investments play an important role. Investment can be either from the public, but also from the private sector. And those from the public we usually refer to as government spendings. In addition, international trade interactions with international markets, where you export certain goods that are produced. In North Dakota, for instance, think about soya beans, right? Think about all the agricultural goods that we produce, but also think about energy. These play an important role for many Midwestern economies. For the United States, overall, the GDP to trade, or the trade to GDP ratio is about 27%. So what we import and what we export divided by the overall GDP is about 27%. For the Midwest region, that number is a bit lower, about 14%. So before we start talking about fragmentation and these nice terms that have been coming up over the last couple of years, I want to give you a bit of a backdrop of how globalization had been evolving over the last 100 years. And that figure you might seen in a newspaper earlier or in a class or in a different environment. That figure tells you how trade openness and trade between rival geopolitical blocs had been shifting over the years. So what is a geopolitical bloc, right? Remember Cold War, we had the Russians and we had the Americans basically, and they were having their own influence spheres. And that's what we do here too. We compare basically blocs, countries that are aligned with those that are non-aligned. So the first observation that you see in this data, looking at the global trade to GDP ratio, is that ratio had been about 30% during the golden age of trade, which we usually refer to between the 1860s and early 19th century, right? When the First and Second World War started, we saw that drop in international trade, markets had becoming less integrated, and then with the post-war order, trade to GDP ratio had been growing significantly actually. And then came the end of the Eastern Bloc and the integration of global markets. The rise of China and trade to GDP ratio had been going up to almost 70%. So for every dollar made in America, $0.7 are traded. That's a staggering number, actually. And since 2008, we saw that period where there wasn't any additional global trade integration, what we now refer to as snowballization. It's a neat term to describe this no change anymore in global trade integration. And now look at the red figure. The red figure compares trade between blocs over time. And trade between blocs, right, how much does the West trade with the East, for instance? And that had been hovering about 10% in the period from 1860 to 1940. But then, right, communism started to rise in Eastern Europe and in Asia as well. And that integration had been coming down significantly. So what led to all this growth that we had been seeing since the 1990s? And an important factor is actually the integration across economic blocs. Right? We trade a lot more with China, we trade a lot more with Russia, and we trade a lot more with blocs that we hadn't been interacting with. And that number had been coming up to about 25% before we saw the turmoils of the last 5 to 10 years. So now we are in 2009, right? And we see that development, that snowballization started, trade doesn't grow anymore. And the question is, what causes this shift? What are the factors that are driving these disruptions in global trade and market integration? And one important factor of this fragmentation of global supply chains is there are more policies in place. Economic leaders, or leaders in general, started to introduce a lot of additional industrial policies. And these industrial policies, if we think about them, 70% of those policies actually have an impact on trade and investment. They impact not just domestic companies, but they also impact foreign companies. Think about subsidies, think about tax incentives for the ships industry and other incentives that have been put in place. And the left figure here shows you actually an indication on how that had been expanding over time. And you see in 2009, there had been about 300 measures put in place globally. Now, 2022, there are more than 3,000 trade and investment distorting measures. So a huge increase, a lot of friction, right, in the global trade system right now, where countries try and tend to protect their domestic markets. On the right-hand side, you see results from a recent paper in the American Economic Review by Caldera and colleagues. They constructed what they called a geopolitical risk index. And that geopolitical risk index basically looks into all the newspaper articles that are out there and use a machine learning approach to understand how that had been evolving over time. And what you see is not surprising, right? It had been pretty flat in the 2000s, things were good, right? A part of the 2008 period, basically. But there wasn't a lot going on. You had the Crimea annexation by Russia in 2014. You had the Russia-Ukraine war starting in 2022, and you see that significant increase, right, in geopolitical uncertainty. And then you had October 2023, right, when Hamas attacked in Israel, basically. So there's a lot more uncertainty in the global market. And the question is, how does that increase in uncertainty affects trade? How does it affect economic well-being? Looking at that other index, it's a fragmentation index. So what the authors have been doing here, they basically looked into all the earnings reports that companies are putting out around the globe. And they looked for terms like deglobalization, reshoring, onshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, localization, and regionalization to get an idea on how important these kind of fragmentation forces are for companies. And you see a very clear trend, right? The blue line, upward trending significantly. So a lot of the recent earnings reports actually contain concerns about how the fragmenting global economy is affecting the bottom line of those businesses. What's the difference between the 1970s, 1980s, right, our fights with the Russians, basically, and today? Well, when we go back to the Cold War period, the global trade wasn't as integrated. And during that period, global trade to GDP ratio was about 25%. Today, it's about 60%. So it's almost more than twice as large, basically. So we are a lot more dependent, actually. At the same time, we see that global alignments in ideology had been shifting as well. While in the past, basically, if you were part of the Western Bloc, you were part of the Western Bloc. If you ask Eastern Bloc, you don't get out, basically. They all tried to get out, the Czech tried to get out, the Germans tried to get out. There was no way out, basically. So you were stuck, basically. There was not a lot of ideological shift. But now in recent years, that shifting had been going on much quicker and a lot more frequency, actually. So we see ideologies are shifting around the globe. And that's a concern, but also an opportunity that I want to talk a bit more about. So what you see on the left-hand side is a figure that shows the share of population for Western Bloc, Eastern Bloc, and non-aligned countries. Again, comparing the Cold War period with what we see right now. And not surprising, about 50% of countries had been aligned, right, to the Eastern or the Western Bloc, and 46% had been non-aligned. Today, that number had been falling significantly. The Western share in the global population had been coming down to less than 10%. So every 10th person in that room is a Western aligned person, basically. Well, at the same time, the countries that are non-aligned, or their population share, had been grown to 66%. So huge expansion of non-aligned countries in terms of the overall population. The right-hand figure is even more interesting, right? It looks into who's trading with whom. And here we look into three groups. Within, in light green, between blocks, and with non-aligned countries. And most of trade happened actually in the past between the same bloc countries, right? The West was trading with the West, and the East was trading with the East. Between trade didn't matter at all. A bit of grain trade with Russia, but otherwise there hadn't been a lot going on. Now things look fairly different. About 50% of all the trade that is ongoing is with non-aligned countries. So that are neither saying, okay, we align with the East or we align with the West, basically. The share of between trade had been basically staying the same. So, and that brings us to the question, right? How did these recent geopolitical disruptions impact trade, and how did they impact FDI? I mean, a logical reaction is, if you think about disruptions between China and the United States, well, China should trade a lot more with other countries, right? And also trade with their partners. So what we see is actually that within blocks, trade had been coming down by 1%. Between blocks, this number had been crushing. A 5% reduction basically in trade. With non-aligned countries, also a slight disruption since the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, about 2% down. If we look at the other side, it's foreign direct investment. So basically, when a company decides to either have a greenfield or brownfield investment in a foreign country to expand production by buying another company or by building a new factory, we don't invest as much in our partners anymore. We also don't invest in China anymore. That had been coming down significantly, but we invest in other markets. So US multinational companies are expanding in Vietnam, they expand in India, in countries that are neither aligned with us nor the Eastern Bloc. At the same time, we sever our links in terms of trade with partners that we had been trading before. In the left-hand side, you see US imports from China, basically percentage of total, and compare that to Mexico and with other non-aligned Asian countries. China was about 22% of US trade in 2016, so a fairly large number. This had been coming down to about 12%, so huge redirections of trade. Mexico had been about 12%, is now up to almost 16%, so a significant expansion, while other non-aligned Asian countries, Vietnam, Myanmar, and others, saw a significant expansion of their trade with the United States. And as an early sign of how things are developing, you look at the FDI figure. Where is US investing? It's in India. It's in the United Arab Emirates. It's in Mexico. China investment had been coming down significantly. So that's kind of the backdrop of what I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes. We see less trade between blocks. We see less investment in the other bloc, as well as an outlook that is telling us that markets become disrupted, supply chains become more fragmented. And what do I mean with fragmentation of supply chains? Well, if you want to think about fragmentation of supply chains, you can think about companies in a network, right? You have companies in China, you have companies in America, and they want to import goods from the other country. And the question is, how do they get those goods, obviously? How many steps are required to get a product from the United States, from China, sorry, to the United States, actually? And what you see here is a comparison. It's from a network analysis, basically, of global firm-level data to understand how the sourcing networks is functioning. Recently came out by Challey and colleagues. And what they find that for the United States had already pretty long supply chains. And those have been increasing significantly. Similar patterns are observable for China and Europe, while the rest of Asia Pacific had been reducing the length of their supply chains, actually. So we have to go much further to source the products that we need. And why is that a concern? It's costly, right? And costly means you pay more for the goods that you're consuming, basically. So, and that brings us to the question, what are the costs that are associated with this kind of fragmentation of global markets and global supply chains? Obviously, from an economic perspective, we have these usual concepts, right? Economies of scale. You do a lot more, you're getting reduced average cost, and so it's a lot more efficient to do that, basically. You specialize in producing a good, you get better doing it, you allocate resources more efficiently. So we focus on what we are good in, and everyone else is focused on what they are good in, basically. Technological diffusion works better, right? If you have a new technology coming in, like a green technology, think about solar panel. If you put high tariffs on solar panel for China, which is a main manufacturer of those products, well, solar panel adaptation in US is going to go down, and that is going to harm some of the other market incentives that you have, also incentives that are there. And also you have an issue with competition. If there's higher fragmentation costs, there's less competition, and again, that means higher prices. At the same time, we see that capital flows are severely harmed. You saw FDI coming down, right? Bank flows coming down, services is going to be lower. And that is, again, an issue of more risk in the market. There's more market volatility, right? You see 1 year you are growing 6%, as you saw in the Midwestern data, and next year you're dumping down 4%. So it's like a lot more volatility in that trading system. As well as there are barriers to labor flow integration, right? You want the best minds in America to produce the products that we are good in, basically. And these barriers to labor migration mean that there's less innovation, and also there are demographic issues that come with it, as you see in Europe, for instance. So, and all that means why there are these temporary issues that come up there. You see prices under pressure, you see supply chain shortages that we had been experienced in 2021 and 2022. There are all these concerns with a less integrated global economy. But the most important part that is often underlooked is how global cooperation is functioning. You may recall from the news or from one of your classes the Paris Climate Accord, right? And how long it took to negotiate that one. Now the issue is we can't implement those things because all of these global cooperation things have become so much more complicated. If you have geopolitical blocks, not everyone is interacting and negotiating with the same incentives. So what do these fragmentation costs mean for the global economy? And here are some daring numbers. On the left-hand side, this is from an IMF study that was recently conducted, I think 4 months out, this was published, that looked into what are the cost of fragmentation, global fragmentation for GDP. We're comparing here advanced economies with emerging economies and low-income countries. And not surprisingly, right, for advanced economies, it matters, but it doesn't matter too much. You have a distribution where some are actually benefiting, the majority loses about 2%, 3% of GDP, but overall it's not very big. When you talk about emerging markets, you see a much longer tail, right? There are a couple of countries that are really losing out, and then there are also a couple of countries that are gaining. When it comes to the low-income countries, we see large losses of GDP. Okay, so, and these are the implications of trade fragmentation. On the other hand, we also have the issue of foreign direct investment, right, where companies don't invest anymore, where they get the best return to their investment, basically. We see that these costs are fairly significant. And here we compare the US bloc with the China bloc and the group of non-aligned countries. US doesn't matter too much. It's about 0.5% drop in GDP because US is a consumption-oriented economy. EU, it matters a lot more. But once you move to the China bloc or the Asia bloc, right, Asia-Russia bloc, you see those numbers are getting really big. 6% GDP loss, actually. And overall for the world, it means a 2% loss in GDP. So the question is obviously, like, what's the best strategy? You're in a world that is more polar, basically. You have more aligned countries that are either aligning with the West or with the East, but at the same time you have a lot of non-aligned countries, as we see. What's the best strategies for those countries? What we compare here is the economic impact of a two-block kind of world where you have US and Europe, and you have countries aligning with the US-Europe bloc versus the China-Russia bloc, and you have an alternative where you basically have a three-block system. You have US and Europe, you have China and Russia, and then you have the other countries, basically. So are there opportunities for arbitrage? And if you look at those numbers, right, if we would live in a world where non-aligned countries exist and they are not forced to align, the overall GDP impacts actually, or the deviation from the baseline scenarios, are actually pretty large, particularly for those countries that align with China and Russia. They would gain about 5% more GDP. So non-alignment is actually a valid strategy for dealing with the increasing negative effects of economic fragmentation. So the question is, right, now, if we see all this fragmentation, we see all those goals, what can be done? And my suggestion, my thinking here is obviously that we still have topics that unite us. It's not just that we disagree on everything and there's a complete fallout. There are many issues that actually align between countries. Think about climate change or how to deal with AI and either regulate or open it up. So there's a lot of agreement, common ground for discussion on those things. So there is a potential to find solutions that are multilateral. At the same time, for specific issues where interests are more aligned between certain groups of countries, think about trade in semiconductors, for instance. It makes sense to integrate more local, more regionally, and deepen economic ties between these aligned countries. At the same time, when we think about these trade disrupting policies that I had been showing earlier, it actually makes sense to revise those. You shouldn't have them in place forever. You should reevaluate a sunset kind of review every couple of years and say, okay, do we still need this policy? Is China still harming us? What's the cost and what's the benefit of those policies? And that brings us to the second part of this talk, is now we talked a lot about trade and global markets, but trade and global markets don't go without industrial policy because they are part of industrial policy. And industrial policy has an international component and a domestic component. So let's talk about domestic now for a minute because there's some really interesting insights here. And this is from Jack Sullivan, who is the National Security Advisor of the Biden administration. Modern American industrial strategies identify specific sectors that are foundational to economic growth, strategic from a national security perspective, and where private industry on its own isn't poised to make the investments needed to secure national ambitions. It deploys targeted public investments in these areas that unlock the power and ingenuity of private markets, capitalism, and competition to lay a foundation for long-term growth. Who agrees with this comment? Raise your hand. Is this something you agree with? Yep. All right, so that's the new US policy, right, is industrial policy. We go back into a world where we don't think about global markets, but we think about how to make domestic markets better. And let me give you here some numbers, give you an idea how big of a shift this is. And what you see in this graph are real manufacturing construction spending. And we are comparing here different industries, and one thing comes out, right? After the CHIPS Act has been passed in August, which was about $1 trillion in combination with the IRA, basically, so that manufacturing investments have been skyrocketing from less than 10 billion annually to more than $100 billion. So quite a significant increase. And that's due to public investment. And one was the IRA, and the other one is the CHIPS Act. So, and the question is, right, what is driving this manufacturing growth that we have been seeing over the last years and all these announcements? And what we see is that there is growth is not driven by public sector investments itself. Public sector investments are down to about 400 billion. It's primarily the private sector that is investing significantly in increasing manufacturing capacity in the United States. So to give you an idea of how these investments are structured across the Midwest, but also more globally across the entire United States, you see here in red semiconductor and electronic investments, clean energy investments, EV in blue, biomanufacturing, and got some kind of greenish, and heavy industry in orange. So what you see in that data, right, there's a lot of investment into semiconductors and clean energy, kind of EV-related investments. In North Dakota, right, we have these investments in Bismarck and up in Grand Forks, actually primarily related to green energy. Over the other parts of the Midwest, I mean, Michigan is benefiting significantly from EV investments as well. So the White House had been pushing significant money into expanding production capacities for semiconductors and expanding abilities for America to be part of the green revolution. That speaks to Sullivan's strategy that he announced earlier. We want to identify national champions, things that we are good in that no one else is good in, basically, and invest heavily by providing tax incentives and subsidies. We're not the only ones doing that. Everyone globally is doing that, actually. On the left-hand side, you see the number of industrial policy measures implemented in 2023, and that's just 2023. It's about 2,000 different industrial policies that have been implemented across the globe, giving tax incentives, providing subsidies, giving grants for companies to invest into production capacities. And most of that, about 80% of the investments, are in advanced economies. So all of these announcements, right, are coming from advanced economies. To give you some ideas, the European Union has invested about 500 billion overall in green energy and its semiconductor industry. Japan announced about 100 million investment into the semiconductor industry. Korea is investing about 15 billion into its industry. So all across the globe, we see huge investment in the same industries. Semiconductors, green, right? Everyone is kind of having a very similar strategy, actually. And that obviously points to the question, right? We see that increase, but what does the increase entail? And that's what you see in the right-hand side is what type of policies have been put in place. So everyone is doing it differently. The United States is more investing into tax incentives. That means you're investing, you're allowing the company to basically write off expenditure for the investment into the future. The European Union likes to give grants out for research and investment, etc., and provides upfront investment, basically. But overall, we see that the advanced economies have been expanding the number of subsidy policies significantly. So the question is, right, if you invest into your domestic economy, does it have an impact on other countries? Likely yes, right? I mean, you invest, you build up your production capacity in China, ships have to go somewhere. They're not going to be retained in China. They need to get into the domestic market. And Economics 101 tells you, well, if you have more supply, prices are coming down. But in addition to that, it's not just that countries implement inward-focused investment policies, but it's also that these investment policies actually constrain trade distorting policies as well. So instead of just saying, okay, we invest into our economy to make it stronger in semiconductors and clean energy, we also say, but the Europeans are not going to send any of their semiconductors into our market. So we build these, what we call national champions. And that's exactly what you see in terms of these recent industrial policies. Most of them, 70%, contain policies that limit or affect trade and investment. And on the right-hand side, you see the reasons. There was a great study by Everett, who's a professor at the University of Zurich, that looked into the different reasons that are put forward in those policies on why we implement trade disruptions. And it's kind of funky. Because the main reason that is put forward is competition. So, okay. So the main reason that is put forward is competition, arguing basically that while there are unfair trade practices by those other countries that impact our ability to fairly compete. Another argument that is put forward is climate issues. Climate being a main argument to say, okay, we need to limit trade to allow our industry to produce its own solar panel. The same also about GVC had been argued to be a concern, as well as national security, which is primarily a concern in America. So if we, a second, this is kind of funky. So the question is, right, if all these policies are coming in, what are good policies and what are bad policies? And what defines a policy that is actually efficient versus one that isn't? Well, if we think about industrial policy, it's definitely not a solution that works for everyone. The goal is here, right, we want to foster innovation. We want to be at the technological frontier and advance quicker than our competitors in developing new technologies. So in that sense, broadband investments have trade-offs. At the same time, these investments into new technology or industries that are at the frontier also are raising concern about fiscal stability. Right? If the US puts $1 trillion out into investing in those industries, someone has to pay that, likely in the future. As well as there are concerns about how these new technologies are diffused. If you develop a new technology and it's for advancing climate change concerns or dealing with mitigating climate change concerns, then it's key that those technologies are actually getting out into the world quickly instead of being kept in specific countries. So what are the conditions for effective policies, right? When we think about these technologies, they shouldn't be just fostering a specific industry that we want to grow. These industries need to be connected to an externality. They need to create additional social welfare. Because the concern is that, you know how America works, right? It's lobbyism. So industries tend to capture political interest to a certain degree. In that sense, what industries that should be receiving those benefits should create actually additional benefits due to dealing with externalities such as emissions, but also may create social benefits by creating knowledge spillover effects. And an important factor for efficient innovation policies in that sense is that they are non-discriminatory, or that you don't discriminate a foreign company because it's from Europe against an American company. Well, at the end, where the money comes from, doesn't matter. It's about the jobs and the innovation is created. And then related to that, right, the question is, what is the right strategies to implement those policies? Do you subsidize an industry or do you provide tax breaks? And in that sense, right, are these incentives actually leading to industries becoming more effective and productive in producing their goods, or is it just a way to take the money and then move the machinery to another place? I grew up in an area where we had a lot of solar panel producers for 5 years. They took the subsidies, they stayed 5 years, and then they moved the factory out into, where was it, Vietnam, actually, because machinery can move, right? People cannot move. So in that sense, if we make these investments, how we ensure that these industries are sustained, that the supply and demand are there basically for the products they produce, and reduce misalignments basically. So, and that brings us to this idea that had been floating around about national champions, right? What is a national champion? Well, a national champion is a company or an industry that is really leading on a global scale, that produces goods that are more technologically more advanced than any other industry globally, and that can do it at a lower cost. So in that sense, if we think about, now I know where it's going down. So if we think about national champions, a policymaker has to make a decision. It has to deal with financial and fiscal stability on one hand, and it has to deal on the other hand with economic growth. But we want to, on one hand, to make sure that there is financial stability, and on the other hand, we want to maximize economic growth. And that leads us to different strategies on how to achieve those goals. Right? One strategy, obviously, and that's a kind of a continuum and a dilemma to a certain degree, is we want to ideally be in a free market economy, because a free market economy is an economy that reduces rent-seeking possibilities, right? It means lower prices for consumers as well as a more efficient allocation of resources. So in that sense, if we think about strategy C, right, that's a strategy that a policymaker might not want to deliver on because it might not get the economic growth as quickly as wished. The other strategy is strategy A, support safe champions, right? The downside of that approach is you're going to see less economic growth, but you know that, well, it's less costly to do that. Actually, we have already that industry in place. It makes sense to do that investment. An alternative strategy is a more bold one, where you say, okay, we want to grow a semiconductor industry in America, in Bismarck, North Dakota, out of nowhere, basically. Well, that's a really bold strategy. That is also a really risky one because you need the labor, you need the demand for those products. There are a lot of factors that go into it. But it's also potentially a very promising strategy. So let me provide you some perspective from a policymaker, right? If you're in DC and have to decide, okay, should I vote on the $1 trillion package or not? And let's conceptualize this from an economics perspective, right? We have to think about financial and fiscal stability. You want to make sure that on one end you are not taking too much risk in terms of financial and fiscal stability, and on the other hand, the policymaker wants to increase economic growth as much as possible because you want to deliver for your constituents. And that brings us to the goal of minimizing the risk that is associated with any industrial policy, while at the same time you want to ensure that you maximize growth. So, and that can be conceptualized by introducing what we call efficiency frontiers. So an efficiency frontier is obviously one that has no national champions, because a national champion again means that you have a monopolist potentially or an oligopoly that is capturing some of the market. And that's option C. That's what a government should ideally go for, that is caring about efficiency. But that's not what a policymaker is interested in. You want to deliver, right? You want big announcement. I shouldn't say Senator Hoeven announces or a policymaker announces $50 billion investment into North Dakota, $50 investment into whatever infrastructure. These are quick turnaround gratifications to a certain degree, and they are quick turnaround actually wins. Long run means it's costly, right? If you think about long run announcements and long run investments, making those decisions tend to be more difficult, and they are not rewarded in a past media environment. In that sense, if we think about the optimal strategy for a policymaker, is dealing with the anxiety of not having enough growth, right? The economy is collapsing. What should we do? Okay, Trump is going to win. Oh no, we need to put money out. We need to invest and create economic growth. So in that sense, the policymaker is captured itself by the anxiety that it has about having too little economic growth, actually. And that's why we see around the globe this investment into national champions. Right? We have this strategy to put big money out, tax incentives, subsidies, to make sure that we build these national champions, even if they are economically not efficient, and even if they are creating a lot of additional cost. And that brings us to another kind of political economic perspective to that problem is, well, if we think about the returns to those investments, they tend to be rather low. And they fall with the degree of political capture. The more captured an industry is, the stronger lobbyism is in an industry. The benefits of an industrial policy turn from positive to negative very quickly. And that's based on a recent study by Diaz and Sanchez from the European Union that shows that if an industry is about 20% captured by political lobbying group, the impacts are largely turning negative. However, if we think about policies that are actually having goals to deal with externalities or increasing social welfare, those policies tend to perform much better, largely because they also, on top of the economic benefits that they give to the industry itself and the labor that works in that industry, they also address that externality. So an industry can be a lot more captured to still create a positive economic outcome. And that's maybe a good example is agriculture to a certain degree, right? Think about greenhouse emissions and the recent discussion about ethanol-based biofuels. It's a captured industry, let's be honest about what that industry is. But at the same time, it deals with an important externality, which is the issue of how to address climate change. So what are effective industrial policies and how do they need to be implemented? First of all, they need to be industries that create these kind of spillover effects. But you need to be able to create an industry that has a lot of suppliers that are supplying input to that industries and create spillover effects in research and innovation. AI industry is a good example, or ship industry in general. It needs to be an industry, right, that is also supported by surrounding industries. If you want to invest into green infrastructure or a green industry, you need to target these subsidies, but be transparent about how you do that, while also how to actually price carbon correctly. At the same time, governments need to not just put a policy in place, they also have to have the technical capabilities to manage those investments actually. And that's, for instance, one of the issues that we see right now with the $1 trillion investments. It takes a while to set all these things up. The government needs the infrastructure to dole out the money. At the same time, we want to ensure that markets remain competitive. We don't want a monopolist that is going to charge you $10,000 for your iPhone moving forward. Avoid that situation. And here, an important factor is actually innovation. But innovation isn't necessarily private sector innovation alone. It's a mix of strategies where funds need to be allocated to research, but also funds to support venture capital and investment, and provide tax incentive for those that are broadening innovation. A recent study showed that if you increase spending on research by about 0.5%, it leads to a 2% return to GDP. So a pretty big gain actually. And also it remains to be taken into consideration that on topics where we are united, it makes sense to collaborate. Okay, thank you for your attention. I made it on time.
I forgot the microphone up here. We're going to try to pass the microphone to people to ask questions, but I'll just start with an initial question. I mean, so I know you talked a little bit about, that industrial policy is not necessarily the best, but you talked about political motivation for it, but I'm going to just push a little bit further in that direction. So you talked about the right industrial policy or the right industries. So my question is doesn't it require a lot of faith in some expert? I mean, if there's an industry where let's say the United States is really good at that in that particular industry, shouldn't there be private investors that are willing to fund investment in that particular industry? And so why should what kind of confidence should we have in some expert to say this is where we should make these investments? Because again, you're taking away, not only are you boosting that particular industry, but you're taking away resources from other industries by doing that. So that's kind of a commentary, but a bit more of a question, actually.
Yeah, sure. First consideration is obviously national security, right? Do we want our supply chain to be dependent on China in terms of when a conflict hits? Not really. So that's the first consideration that gives rise to the semiconductor investments that we have been seeing over the years. Second consideration, is externalities. How to deal with climate change. A company itself isn't really incentivized to develop in technologies that is more expensive potentially, right? Because it doesn't have the scale. If we think about the development of a company and investment into a new technology, you have really high cost. You need to scale that industry and get into a scope economies basically to be able to benefit effectively from that. And every country has to make a decision what are the industries that are of national security or that create significant externalities and benefits for those. So in that sense, come to your argument, there's always a trade-off, and there has to be discussion what are the costs and benefits of those decision-making. But that brings us to the earlier part of the talk where we talked about geopolitical fragmentation and economic blocks actually that lead to decisions not being made optimally. But in an optimal world, there would be a free market economy where everyone would be interacting in a fair and competitive manner. But that's not the world we are living in. So we have to think about what is the second best that at the same time uses resources as effective as possible.
Okay, thanks. If you have, okay. So maybe just try to talk really loud.
Thank you, Sandro. That was a great presentation. I have a question. I wonder if that supply chain fragmentation is also because of changes in demand. So today firms also postpone until the end. It is not only that firms produce, but they also postpone, and that also has an effect on fragmentation, and also the reshoring and nearshoring effects due to the desire of firms to ensure access to critical resources. So I am wondering about the role of those effects, given that, for instance, for the policy is maybe about 10% of GDP, and that is going to be spread over a period of 10 years. So if that has actually an effect, a relevant effect on fragmentation.
Okay, so Alfredo's question was, we see this tendency of nearshoring, friendshoring, where you bring production chains that had been in Asia back to Mexico, back to Canada, basically, and what are the implications of these delays in decision making actually on GDP? That's my understanding of your question. So in that sense, right, we see these trends, right, and these trends take time to adjust. I mean, Mexico's trade with the United States had been exploding virtually. And much of it is obviously driven by these incentives by companies to produce, but it's also an incentive by the Chinese. Right? We talked about non-aligned countries in the beginning, and we saw that non-aligned countries can actually benefit from a divided world by basically capitalizing as an intermediate between the West and the East. So in that sense, right, all of these decisions on nearshoring or friendshoring are not just driven by US consideration, but they're also driven by consideration of Chinese suppliers. You want to outsource production into a country where you have access to cheap labor and access to the Western market. So that's a pretty valid strategy, and there have been a lot of concerns recently, particularly with Mexico, that Chinese companies are shipping to Mexico, repackaging and bringing it into the United States, actually. So these are concerns. How those effects play out in terms of industrial policy, I mean, these are valid industrial policies for non-aligned countries. They want to incentivize those investments because they employ, right? They extend the employment of their local workforce, actually, and they open up opportunities for those businesses. Whether it's efficient, that's on a different sheet of paper, because there are likely not efficient policies because you implement new costs to the trading system.
Hi, Sandro. Thank you so much. Great presentation. So I have a quick question. So the graph that you show about the geopolitical risk index and also the fragmentation index. So it seemed like the two graphs move in tandem with one another until the last quarter of 2023. So what happening there? Like, why do they move? One move up, another one is moving down, and yeah, that one. So if you're looking at the right-hand graph, like the last quarter, like one moving up, another one moving down. Usually they move in tandem with one another. Yeah. The follow-up question is one more question because I don't know if I'm gonna get a chance to ask again. So you categorize like some country like in Southeast Asia, for example, like Vietnam as a non-ally. But I'm come from Southeast Asia, and I know that like Vietnam have a very big conflict with China, for example, like Philippines, like South China Sea, for example. So I don't think they really I think they have a good reason why they want to ally with the United States.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Sure. So first question, the geopolitical risk index, why it's coming up and down, right? Russia-Ukraine was the first spike that you saw happening. And then people realized, okay, the news had been coming down, there's less discussion, right? We know that we are in a war, things are calming down significantly. And the other spike that you see at the end is October 2023, when the Hamas attacks in Israel took place, basically. That's the second spike. Regarding your question, who is non-aligned, who is aligned, right? That's what I showed later. I can go to that briefly. So basically, right, there are obviously countries that are leaning more towards the United States or that are leaning more to China and Russia. And in that sense, right, to make that distinction and say Vietnam is part of the US bloc, I don't think so. They are a good intermediate that is benefiting by good relationships with the United States, actually, by getting access to market. I mean, the manufacturing boom in Vietnam is largely fueled by investments from China as well, particularly in the north of Vietnam, actually. And they benefited hugely from global value chain integration by being basically an intermediate, being on both sides to a certain degree. Politically, it's a different thing. I mean, China and Vietnam have an interesting history, as the US and Vietnam has, basically, and the French and Vietnam have. So there's a lot going on in history, actually. But the current economic reality is that Vietnam benefits from the investment in China and investment flowing into the country to serve, particularly in textile, but also in higher value manufacturing, the global market. Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So, I just don't know, how much of the fragmentation is because of policies that are discriminatory, and how much of it is just because people have realized that it's really difficult to do business with corrupt autocracies? And how much is policy can policy, how much of a dent can it make in this kind of fragmentation as long as these other countries remain difficult to work with?
So that's a hypothetical question, right? We know from simulations that actually the economic costs are pretty significant for the US bloc. I mean, if you look at Europe, right, GDP is about 2% down due to FDI fragmentation forces, and that are mainly what we look into this figure, right, is policy-related fragmentation. No any other strategic decision-making of companies to de-invest into certain markets, because that's part of the ballgame, right? If you're a multinational company, do you want to remain in China? Do you want to remain in Russia? Some decide to do so. Pepsi, Coca-Cola decided to go out. So other companies were forced to de-invest at a particular high sellout price, at a really, really big loss, basically. So there is this, what we discussed today about is only fragmentation costs that are related to policies that are in place. There's likely an additional fragmentation that is going on by strategic decision-making of companies. If I'm a company, I will work where I can make money, right? If it's an autocracy or not, primarily I don't care, as long as I can make $1 out of it, actually. So the political consideration, I think, is less of a consideration for business. If I'm forced from my domestic country to consider that, I would do that, or by my stakeholders and shareholders, basically.
I'm not sure if anybody has any question about it. So from your go back to John's questions about let the expert chose what is a national champion. From your perspective, is it often right or wrong that experts always know what to invest in, like from the public investment, or should we let the market decide what is the best industry in this country?
So there are different approaches to this thing, right? I mean, Europe has an approach which works mainly with grants. They invest significantly into research and development. The US approach works mainly with tax incentives. So basically, you have a new factory that is building up somewhere, you give it tax incentives, they don't pay taxes for the next 20 years. But we have our kids pay for the cost, basically. That's the US approach, while the Europeans tend to upfront it to the current taxpayer, basically. What a good investment is, a bad investment, right, is again a question of what is national security relevant, and at the same time, what are externalities that you as a policymaker want to address. And climate change is a big concern that shouldn't be ignored. So fostering investments into these industries, obviously an investment that is politically giving a good return, as well as economically once you get the industry up, and that's the assumption. But based on history, there are many industry policies that failed, or failed miserably. I mean, the factory where I grew up got $2 billion. Well, now you can go there and drive as a cart around, basically. That's a factory right now. So the question is, right, you never know. And that's why I think it's important for the US government actually to rely on advice from their research teams, from outside units that explain what are the costs and benefits involved with all of these decisions, and what is the certainty of those investments actually paying off.
We're out of time. It's 11 o'clock right now. This is our last event for the year, so please join us next year. We have a lot of good things that are starting to get lined up for next year. So thanks everyone for coming. Let's give one more round of applause to Sandro.